And it's my pleasure to introduce our next keynote speaker, Adam Posen, who will be talking about what the U.S. can learn from Abenomics. Adam was, I knew Adam when he was just a junior official at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in the 1990s, and was starting his series of papers on Japan. He's now written so much on Japan and comes to Japan so frequently that some people think his name is not Adam Posen, but Adam Posen. As many of you are aware, Adam has had a meteoric rise through the policy world, serving not only at in the Federal Reserve Bank, but also most recently on the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England, before becoming the president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, which is, I think, the best American think tank that focuses on international economics. It is my go-to place for reading economic analysis on anything related to international. Adam also deserves a lot of credit as one of the first people to recognize and discuss the potential of fiscal policy in Japan in a very influential monograph. And I think he's done some of the most original work on Japanese macro policy of any Western economist. He's a good friend of the Center on Japanese Economy and Business, and he's spoken at many of our events in Tokyo and as well as at Columbia, and has worked with Hugh and me on a variety of different contexts. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to Adam. Adam is many things, but one thing he's not is boring. His work is always provocative and interesting. Adam?
Thank you all very much. David is much too generous, and I fear I will be very boring. This is like we talked about it being tough for the BOJ. You set expectations, you have to meet the target. It's a problem. One note, I actually don't intend to say anything about monetary policy because between Governor Kuroda and my three friends, Rich, Taka, and Paul, I basically agree with 97% of what was said. So I will not offer any remarks on monetary policy. I will just stop a moment to say how proud I am to be here in this beautiful new building on this terrific occasion, because the Center for Japanese Economy and Business, in particular the colleagueship and the friendship and the mentoring and the role model that the two-headed dragon of Hugh and David has been, for me has been enormous, going back to when I first started working on Japan. They welcomed me in, they encouraged me, they corrected me gently, and they've been models of scholarship and colleagueship ever since. And so it's very proud for me to be part of any Columbia event, but particularly this one. Since I'm not going to be talking about monetary policy, what's left? Well, depending how you count it, there's at least two arrows out there. But the premise that I was going with after discussions with David and Hugh was what the U.S. can learn from Abenomics. And what I'm really going to try to do is talk a little bit from a political economy point of view. Now, I know there's a very wise combination of academics and practitioners in the room, as well as market people, so I'm sure everything I say will be found wrong by somebody. But at least I hope, in the spirit of what David said, it will stimulate discussion. My starting point is the same one that I started with back in 1997, and which I think has, if anything, been revalidated increasingly in recent years, which is that basic textbook macroeconomics applies very well to both Japan and to the U.S. And back in the late 90s, that was a controversial point of view after so much effort by many people in both Japan and the U.S. to talk about the specialness of Japan's economy. We've now seen in more recent times the insistence of various things about the specialness of monetary policy right now, which is why I was applauding Paul's remark, because I've made similar remarks about hating the term unconventional. But also, if you, just to annoy Rich Clarida, if you were to continuously read Paul Krugman's blog, you would see repeated statements as a mantra that your textbook economics works. And I think that is true. I think it has been a mistake to overly complicate the economics, and I say that not just because I don't like doing math. But so the second thing I would say is a more political judgment, which is that common to Japan and the U.S., and U.S. has to learn from Japan, is that policy change is possible, but ambition is required. So one of the things that has happened repeatedly about post-crisis Japanese history is that you get these periods of policy inaction where those who don't want to act will come up with 10,000 reasons about why action would be ineffective, self-defeating, impossible, and political suicide. And then every once in a while, in comes Koizumi and Takanaka, or in comes Abe and Kuroda. I'm oversimplifying, obviously. And you find that with no fundamental change in the party system and no change in the form of government, that action is indeed possible. And this remains true as well for the U.S. For me, one of the most depressing things about reading the recent profile of Timothy Geithner in the New York Times Magazine, as well as many of the things that were said by President Obama in recent years, is this sense of, oh, I'm trapped by my politics. There's only so little choice I have. And I find that even more ludicrous in the U.S. context than I did when the succession of prime ministers that both preceded and followed Prime Minister Koizumi were out there saying, I can't do anything, I can't do anything. Whoops, somebody did something. Well, now I really can't do anything. So which leads to my third point, and this is one I've been fighting for a long time, and unfortunately, I seem to be completely unpersuasive, but I will give it another shot. Waiting for a crisis or trying at worst to instill a crisis in order to initiate policy change is to me a fundamentally mistaken point of view. So in Japan, we had repeated cries, oh, well, we'll do something about X, female labor force participation, fiscal sustainability, whaling, fill in the blank, when there actually is a crisis. And doggone it, that crisis hasn't really come. And I kept trying to say, well, it's in part because your definition of crisis is circular. You say it can't be a crisis because nothing's been forced upon us. And I think this is the key insight for Japan and for the U.S., and it kind of relates to something, I apologize, but one of the previous panelists said, I can't remember which, but, because you all were so similar, of course, that the U.S. and Japan are kind of unique economies. You're not too big to fail, but you're too big to fall apart. The idea that Japan or the U.S. will at some point hit a wall, that there will be the fiscal crisis or the collapse of confidence or the capital flight is I think, vastly mistaken. And that's not to say that there weren't terrible things happening in the U.S., for example, in 2008, 2009. But the idea that there was the crisis in the sense that you had a fiscal day of reckoning, to quote a phrase from my old professor at Harvard, that just wasn't going to happen. If you are Greece, if you are Ireland, let alone if you are India or Colombia, that might happen. But not a U.S., not a Japan. And so, in addition to sort of the offensiveness of trying to induce a crisis, the fact is you're not going to get that kind of crisis in Japan. And I think back to a very original paper that David Weinstein and Christian Broda did many years ago. I think it was for the Solutions Project that Hugh and David and Taka ran on debt sustainability in Japan. And they pointed out two things. One, empirically important, that it mattered who held the debt and how much of the debt was double counted. But two, that it's not like we could linearly or even exponentially project to a point when there would be negative children in Japan. You know, it's not, you can't get there from here, no matter how much you would like to spell out these fantasy scenarios in a perverse way. I think another piece of saying beware the crisis, grab the moment voluntarily, is to recognize that popular uprisings are actually very rare. Again, if you're Mr. Sisi in Egypt, you may feel a little differently about this. But in democracies with relative price stability, large-scale legitimacy, absence of large-scale political violence, it really isn't that often that you're going to get the massive populist movements that move things. 1968 was an aberration. And you look at the Japan where for many years I kept wondering, again, no disrespect to my many friends in the audience, but why the hell weren't people burning things in front of the BOJ? And nobody did. And everybody said, well, that's just Japan. But then you turn to the US and you see the horrendous crisis and terrible redistribution of wealth that we had over the last couple decades. And people kept saying, where is the outrage? There was the Occupy movement, there was this protest, there's that protest, but never had any traction. And you look at Europe right now, at Western Europe. And again, this isn't to trivialize the pain of the unemployed in Greece or Spain, and there certainly are protests, but the governments just sort of keep going, yo-de-do. So I think this sense of waiting for crisis is a real problem. A fourth point I would make about US learning from Abenomics and how you pursue economic reform, economic change, is just to remember that there's always room for structural reform, right? So it's not like there's some beatific ideal, whether defined by the imaginary Walrasian auctioneer that everything has a market, and we suddenly have in the Arrow de Breu sense, if I'm allowed to say that, a world of complete markets. Or for those of you who think that was gibberish, that Angel Gurria at the OECD has a little list of what's the exactly right policy for every country, and there's a laundry list, and you know, we all get marks out of 100, 98 out of 100, 72 out of 100, 26 out of 100. There's always room for structural reform. So you look in particular, I want to suggest that in the US and Japan, one of the things that is shared is the fact that our healthcare systems are abysmally inefficient. That if we could make the structural reforms needed in our healthcare systems, we could live off the proceeds for at least a decade. The growth boost would be so large. If anything, it's arguable that the healthcare inefficiencies are even worse in the US than they are in Japan, which is another reminder of just how bad they are in the US. Again, I'm glossing over many specifics and many economic policy points because A, the people in this audience are already very sophisticated and knowledgeable, and B, I want to hit a lot of points in my time. But just to say, there isn't the sense that you stop being Zimbabwe or you have your leap forward and then there's nothing to do, or that alternatively there's some fantasy where Japan is being dragged around by a finger-wagging ghost of some 1992 structural impediments initiative US negotiator saying, you know, you must do this, 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 and then once you do those 5 things, we'll like you. That's not the point. The point is that there are gains, significant gains to be had. A second point in this area of structural reform, and this is an area where I am obviously being aspirational rather than realistic, but we have to somehow convince the public as well as markets to accept the fact that public investment is about as difficult to do as private investment. And this is a two-edged sword. So on the one hand, it means that just because we throw money at something called infrastructure or human capital, it doesn't automatically pay off, or that any specific given investment exceeds its return hurdle. Again, Japan is a big lesson on that for the US, a big cautionary tale about so much public investment that seems to have gone to so little. But it also, as I said, at the other side of the coin, the other edge of the sword, is we need to ask people, the public and markets, to be more realistic. That just as in private sector, you do large investments as part of a portfolio. And the idea is the return on the portfolio, and not that every project you undertake has to have a positive return. And we have to start being willing to allow public investment to take more risks and to occasionally fail on a given project, but overall get a portfolio that makes sense. This is a very difficult transition to make, but it's one that we're increasingly going to need. A third point about structural reform, and this just picks up things that I think many of the people in this room have said, and David was, I think, wise to start the meeting with. When you're wasting human capital, the returns on fixing that dwarf essentially everything else you could possibly do. And that includes the impact of demographics. So I'm probably being blunt enough, given this is Japan, but let me take it one more step. If Japan were to properly utilize the college-educated women who are underutilized or unemployed in the country right now, the demographic problem would go away for 20-plus years, easily. And all this constant whining about terminal decline and the inevitability of demographics and the terrible fate that Japan has been dealt and all the rest of it would cease to be an excuse or even a constraint. We know this. I don't want to belabor it because I would hope we all know this. But the numbers are vast. And so when I look at what the Abe government has done, I am in the usual position of many friends of Japan and many friends of the Abe government of saying the glass is 1/8 full. I'm very glad because I've been thirsty for the last 10 years, so I'm glad there's something in the glass, but the glass is 1/8 full. So we've seen, I believe the number is something on the order of 420,000 women rejoining the workforce over the last year or so. I think that's the order of magnitude. People can correct me if I'm wrong. That is, in absolute terms, a huge number and a very impressive achievement. In relative terms to the size of the number of college-educated or even high school-educated underemployed women, it is, let's see, a couple percent. But this is an important message, again, for the US as well as for Japan. One of the things that we forget and don't tend to talk about is when we talk about the US having an acceleration in performance and productivity growth from, say, the late 70s, once you control for the recession, through the 2000s, early 2000s, a big part of that was we finally started making better use of African Americans, and we finally started making better use of women. And this tends to get overlooked, but this was a major source of growth in the US economy. And right now, we are tending to neglect our youth in terms of investment, and that will come back to haunt us. All right. So let me turn now to fiscal policy, which is everyone's favorite topic. Here's where I will go conceptual briefly, and then I will go two specifics just to really annoy people. First, on the I think the important thing to understand is that the political economy of fiscal consolidation is not what people think it is. We had this literature that came out in the academic world led by people like Alberto Alesina, Robert Barrow, Thorsten Persson, many others. And it took hold with a number of people, mostly but not always from center-right and right parties in the developed world. And the story that was told in these papers was it's horribly impossible to ever get support for budget consolidation, that market fears over lack of budget consolidation are a major threat to the functioning of economies on an ongoing basis, that government spending is to be compared with tax cuts or tax increases is a very evil thing, that you need to keep monetary policy separate from fiscal policy and make sure that monetary policy does not overly accommodate fiscal policy. I would suggest that every single one of these contentions, which were taken for granted and which motivated much of the fiscal policies pursued in Japan and in the US and especially in Europe over the last 15 years, is incorrect. There is far more popular support for austerity and for budget control than is often recognized or admitted. The problem in most countries that have sustained, not sustainable, sustained ongoing large deficits is unwillingness to raise taxes, inability to enforce taxes, not runaway public spending. The major problem we have when in the short term, when fiscal policy runs amok, is not crowding out of private investment, it's crowding out of useful public investment, because the money tends to go to the wrong purposes, or when you do consolidation, as has repeatedly been the case in Japan, as has been the case in the US, as has been the case in the UK, you cut public investment first, and you keep the public consumption going. And this is very harmful, but we keep doing it. And perhaps most annoyingly to people, but picking up on something Professor Ito said that I completely agree with regarding central bank independence, there is nothing wrong with monetary policy cooperating with fiscal authorities as long as it's done on a voluntary basis. Europe continues to miss that point. In the US, it's not clear where we are. The cooperation we are seeing between the BOJ and the Abe government right now is highly constructive and is a very important example for all of us. But so let me now go to the two practical points about fiscal policy, which I hope you will not think contradict the past points. The first is, I came to Tokyo this trip. As David says, I'm very fortunate to get to come to Japan often, at least since I've left the Bank of England, and I'm very grateful for those opportunities. And one thing I keep hearing when here, as well as from friends who work on Japan and with Japan in the States, is that the great structural reform that Japan needs and is going to get is corporate tax cuts. I'm trying to think how to say this. If you ask me what my top list of structural reforms would be for Japan, 1 is female labor force participation, 2 is healthcare reform, 3 is broader labor market reform, 4th is agriculture and trade, as David emphasized. If I had to pick a 5th, it would probably be corporate governance, which means that corporate tax reform is somewhere between 6 and 23 on my list. Now, I have many good friends in the Japanese corporate community, and I understand they would like to see their corporate taxes cut. Mazel tov, as my people say. Very good. But I just want to ask you to think about this for a moment. It is true that, and we talked about this at dinner last night, and I learned from the discussion from which I will steal. There is a very clear public finance theory argument to say in Japan there's a horrible bias in tax collection. It is the large multinational corporations, the visible corporations that pay the bulk of the taxes, and it's these very inefficient small and medium, particularly small enterprises that avoid taxes, and this is not only unfair, this is inefficient and distortionary, and therefore if we move to a consumption tax, it will be much more efficient and less distortionary. I agree. Is this going to matter materially for the future of the Japanese economy? No. It's already been established that we know that the vast bulk of Japanese corporations evade tax collection. And that if we started collecting taxes on many of these small companies, they wouldn't exist. So on net, it's not going to make any difference to revenue. There are people who say, well, we need this corporate tax cut because it will increase investment in Japan. This is bizarre, since we know that corporations in Japan have been sitting on vast shares of cash for the last many years, have been completely unresponsive to interest rate incentives in getting rid of that cash, and in fact, more companies around the world, including in the US, are beginning to act that way and sit on their cash and do nothing. So there's something much more deep at stake here than a few marginal points on the tax front. We then get the people who say, well, this will cause an attraction of more foreign investment into Japan. Really? Again, I would be very interested in taking a poll of the people in this room, but it is very difficult for me to believe that the absence of foreign investment in Japan, to the degree there is one, is not due to language barriers, cultural barriers, legal barriers, various unwritten rules, barriers to mergers and acquisition, that those do not swamp the tax rate. Then there are those who say, well, but this is important to keep Japanese companies from offshoring too much production. That, to me, is a false goal for government policy. It has actually been a source of productivity growth and efficiency gain for Japan that they have offshored much of the production and not had the actual labor putting things together in Japan. I did some work for Keidanren more than a dozen years ago, and back then in 2001, Keidanren came out, 2001 or 2002, came out and said, we want to move to a world of made by Japan rather than made in Japan, which is the same decision that all the successful countries have made. Look at the recent publication of the Asian Economic Outlook by the IMF, and there's a huge chapter in there, very interesting work on how much China has moved its production abroad and deepened its supply chains, and Japan has fallen behind within Asia in doing this. So anyway, if we're going to have an Abe government led by a diamond-tipped leader, as he described himself as the drill bit of reform at Davos this year, it is a shame to see it wasted on corporate taxes instead of the other priorities I have mentioned. And that is a sad parallel to the US, where we spend an unbelievable amount of time worrying about marginal tax rates and tax gimmicks rather than tackling healthcare reform, educational investment, and so on. Finally, I'm way over time, but hey, I wasn't boring, right? You know, people probably associate me as being the fiscal dove, and so you may say, okay, why is he out here saying all this? He doesn't want the tax cut. And in fact, if you paid attention, no reason you should have, but if you had noted, rather, some things I said earlier to Wall Street Journal and to Bloomberg, I'm on record, as with many of the economics profession, saying Japan has to continue raising the tax increase, the consumption tax, up to past 20% over the next several years if you want to make the debt sustainable. I'm an optimist because I believe Japan can have a per capita growth rate well in excess of 1.5, and if you combine that with a VAT over 20%, you can make it sustainable and some price inflation. That makes me optimistic. But I still say you have to do that. There is a reality here. Which brings me back to the point I said earlier. The biggest problem for the US and Japan is not runaway spending, it's how little both countries collect in taxes. And it would be nice to see something done about that. Thank you for your attention. I hope this gave some food for thought. I'm sorry it wasn't as lively or as cheerleading as the monetary policy discussion could be. I just agree with that part, so I thought I'd focus on the rest. Thank you.
Great. Well, that was a very provocative and interesting talk. I'd like to. We have a few minutes for questions. I'd like to open it up to the floor for some questions over here.
Hiroshi Ito from Ito Corporation. Thank you for the very interesting lecture. And you mentioned about the labor shortage issue and suggested utilize college-educated women. So from your point of view, what is the biggest barrier that prevent college-educated women from joining or rejoining labor force?
Thank you for that. If I start talking about barriers, I'm going to sound really obnoxious and judgmental. So let me put it this way. What are the things that could be done in an operational sense to make this happen, to get better use of the college-educated women in Japan? And I'm not terribly original here, but just to be clear. First, the Abe government quite rightly said they were going to invest in nursery places and creches and daycare. Increase that investment by scale, by a factor of 10. That's huge. We've seen natural experiments occur this way. So when Germany unified, West and East Germany, for example, had huge child care provision under the socialist communist government. Then upon the unification, this was cut off because they were cut down to West German standards of child care, which are still generous compared to Japan. And there was a plummet in female labor force participation. You can just see it right there in the data. Several percent. So that's big. A second thing that would be big, which again, the Abe government has said, but they're doing on a very unambitious scale, is explicit affirmative action. Quotas. You say a certain number of jobs in the government, and we hope in corporations, we work to get a voluntary agreement that there are going to be a certain number of jobs that you have to promote women into them. Third, we can talk more about flex time and this is stuff I don't know as much about in detail, but there's a great literature out there on Scandinavian models for how you balance work-life. Again, I don't want to get into cultural imperialism. It's not for me to say how Japanese people should allocate household chores or child rearing. It's just to say there is a clear cross-national relationship between how much you reduce the home burdens of the women and put resources in to substitute for that and how much women can participate. And there's a clear issue of affirmative action, as we saw with African Americans in the US, that you have to you have to force a certain familiarity and comfort level to get it done. Those would be my suggestions for what it's worth. Sorry, and one more line, since nobody wants to ask a question. This is in keeping with my general view of Abenomics, which is they broadly have the right ideas and the right policies, they're just not doing enough of them. That's my 1/8 of glass full issue. I mean, it's not that the Abe government hasn't recognized these levers, it's just they're choosing to employ them on a very small scale.
Sorry, just wait for the microphone.
Yes, good speech, Adam. Thank you. That was a lot of fun. Anything specific on the healthcare system for Japan that you would recommend?
Again, here's a place where I think the Abe government is making progress. I'd just like to see them be more ambitious. So part of what they're talking about doing that I think would be right is they're changing some of the zoning laws in what are going to be the special zones, which includes a big chunk of Tokyo, to make it easier to have new hospitals, new equipment, and to have foreigners come in and offer services. I think it's also a liberalization argument, that you want to make more international equivalents for degrees and accreditation so you can get more foreign competition in, and you want to create a little bit more of a private, this is a place where I'll sound very Chicago, I think a private sector solution is needed. You need private sector competition. I hasten to add, Mark, I would prescribe much the same for the U.S. The difference for the U.S. is the U.S. has this superstructure of crazy private insurers and record keeping that burns several percent of GDP a year, which Japan does not. And so you would probably in the U.S. start there. But otherwise, it's about treating healthcare like any other industry, liberalizing, increasing competition, increasing foreign sourcing, making it more transparent, making it more portable that you don't get locked into certain relationships. And again, I think the Abe government understands this and has said the right things, but is doing very little so far to move it along.
So, so one of the things you didn't talk about was immigration, and so that's also been. It's actually reminiscent of a talk that was given by a Japanese person a while back, many years ago, that I attended, in which he said, we have this problem, we've got declining labor force, wages, that's going to put upward pressure on wages, and we have a number of possible solutions. We can raise wages, we can increase number of women workers, we can have immigrants, and we can have robots. And then when pushed, he said, I think robots are the way to go. So one thing you didn't talk about was immigration, which is also on the Prime Minister's list of possible reforms. I wondered if you had any comments on that.
Well, I mean, David, you're absolutely right. In terms of the kinds of issues and problems that I identified, and others would identify, immigration would be another way into it. And particularly, I mentioned taking advantage of college-educated women that are also obviously less skilled women who could be better employed. But there are jobs in Japan, as in most of the rich world, where it makes a lot more sense to have migrant workers of some sort who are at a much lower income level. I think it was last night at our fabulous dinner, which you all wish you could have been at, of course, that we were also talking about the idea that both in Japan and in the U.S., I would argue, we have an issue of people want to come study at the universities, and if the foreigners come and study at the universities, and then we play immigration games and say you have to leave as soon as your scholarship runs out or you graduate, I mean, it's such a waste instead of cream skimming the people who come to your universities and keeping them. So, I mean, this is all true. Why did I emphasize women in Japan, labor force, rather than immigration? A few closely related reasons. First, from a social justice perspective, as much as I would like to treat all people in the world the same, it is, I think, entirely morally reasonable to suggest that you look after the people in your own society first before you look after people in another society. And so the social justice need to be decent to women in this society, to me, trumps the social justice need to be nice to people in neighboring countries. Second, I'm making a political judgment that if forced to choose between nativism and sexism, particularly as Japan's new generations come up, you'd rather go against sexism than go against nativism. I may be wrong about that. Third, I think there's an economic argument or a practical policy argument. The kinds of things I was speaking to the gentleman from Ito Company, you start doing immigration, it's a little more complicated. All that said, I did say to mark the idea that healthcare is a place where international competition is important. It's going to be true in the U.S. as well. I mean, we've got Indian doctors who can do hip replacement operations at same basic quality for a 10th or a 20th of what U.S. doctors charge. And you've got fabulous nurses from the Philippines and Thailand. And I don't mean that in a sexist way, male and female nurses, healthcare workers from the Philippines and Thailand who should be in demand all over the world. So I think if you're going to do immigration, again, to give credit where it's due, I think the Abe government kind of gets this. Healthcare is, I think, in Japan, the place where I would push it most, because you could have very defined immigration come in. I've scared or bored people into submission. There has to be another question out there.
Peter.
Peter Drysdale again. You've talked about two of the arrows. The first was dealt with adequately, more than adequately in the first panel. What about the interdependence between the three arrows, and what do we have to worry about there?
Thank you, Peter. I guess another way in which I'm more of an optimist than many other people, particularly Westerners, on Japanese economy, and this goes with my statement about there's always structural reform to be done, is I don't view Japan as, say, that much infinitely worse off than Italy or France in terms of needing structural reform, despite all these things we've mentioned. And so, in a sense, I view the structural reform as necessary, beneficial, but it's not, but only in the long run sense. It's not this make or break thing that if they don't do the structural reform right now, we're going to see a bond market collapse. So in a sense, I am putting an independence of that there. But as Governor Kuroda spoke about and the other colleagues spoke about in the first panel, if you have a limited labor supply and you start getting to the limit of that, for the first couple of years, that's fine. You're not going to get hyperinflation, and a little bit of wage-driven inflation wouldn't be a bad thing in Japan right now, but it is going to constrain your growth. You want to do something about that. Fiscal policy is an entirely different matter. And Rich Clarida was raising this at dinner last night. It is actually a pattern, particularly with labor market reform, that usually when you do structural reforms, they cause a slowdown in the short term, or at least at a minimum, you don't see the benefits until you're in a recovery. So think about Germany again. Germany did these massive labor market reforms in 2003. The person who did them got booted out of office. They turned out to be extremely effective, but we didn't see the benefits until a recovery started in Germany at the end of 2005 and took place 2006-07. So there is a sequencing issue there. There is a problem there. But at this point, I think on the fiscal arrow, you just got to focus on the fact that if even I'm telling you got to raise your VAT to 20%, you got a problem. You got to do that.
Okay, so I want to thank Adam for a very interesting presentation. We're out of time at this point, so please join me in giving a round of applause.